In February 2017, Parks Canada released exactly 16 plains bison into the Panther Valley of Banff National Park, ground that had not felt a wild hoof in more than 140 years. By 2024, those 16 animals had become more than 130. But the population number is not the story. What was happening underneath the hooves was the part nobody fully predicted. The herd began physically re-engineering the valley through wallows, grazing mosaics, and trail networks in ways that classical mountain ecology had never described. And some of what they are doing, the project's own manager has publicly admitted, does not match what the models said should happen in the Canadian Rockies. Think about that. This is the complete account. What a 2023 peer-reviewed study in Frontiers in Conservation Science revealed. What 7 years of GPS collar data actually shows. And what it means that a species we thought we understood has been carrying ancient ecological instructions that our models could not see. The mainstream prediction was reasonable plains bison belong on flat grasslands, not steep subalpine terrain. The models said they would stay low. They didn't. And what they did instead is rewriting the foundational assumptions of how mountain ecosystems on this continent actually function. Most videos show you the release footage and call it a success. This one follows the evidence to where it gets genuinely disturbing, the possibility that without bison, we were never studying a healthy mountain. We were studying a broken one. The Panther Valley sits in the remote backcountry of Banff National Park, roughly 140 kilometers from the nearest highway, a corridor of subalpine wilderness, accessible in winter only by helicopter or a multi-day ski traverse. It is not a place that makes logistics easy. And on a cold morning in February 2017, Parks Canada chose it deliberately. The operation had taken years to prepare. 16 plains bison, selected from the Elk Island National Park herd, one of the last genetically intact populations on the continent, were loaded into reinforced shipping containers, airlifted by helicopter into the valley, and released into a soft-release pasture designed to let them acclimate before facing the full mountain wilderness. The animals were fitted with GPS collars. Researchers established baseline vegetation surveys. Cameras were positioned. Every variable that could be controlled was controlled. The valley itself had not heard a bison call since the 1880s. The grasses were there. The soil was there. The rivers were there. Everything that a plains bison needs, on the surface, appeared to be in place. The scientific expectation was cautious optimism. Survival was possible. Establishment was uncertain. And full ecological integration was a distant, hopeful ambition. What the models did not account for was what 140 years of absence had actually done to this landscape. And what the bison were about to reveal was that the valley everyone thought they understood had been missing its engine the entire time. To understand why the bison's return matters, at the scale the data suggests, you need to understand what a plains bison actually is, not as an animal, but as a biological process. Ecologists use the term Keystone Species to describe an organism whose impact on its environment is disproportionately large relative to its population size. Remove it, and the ecosystem doesn't just lose one species. It loses the structural logic that holds dozens of other species in place. The bison is not merely a keystone species. It is one of the most powerful ecosystem engineers ever documented on this continent. A 900-kilogram animal whose hooves, wallowing behavior, and grazing patterns actively construct the physical landscape around it rather than simply responding to it. A single bison wallow a bare depression of churned soil created when an animal rolls to shed parasites and regulate temperature can persist in a landscape for decades. It creates standing water after rain, bare mineral soil for pioneer plant species, and microhabitat for insects that feed entire chains of birds and amphibians. Multiply that across a herd of 130 animals moving across 1,200 square kilometers, and you are not describing grazing. You are describing terraforming. But before you can fully understand what the Panther Valley herd is now doing to the land, you need to understand what North America lost and how close we came to losing it forever. Here is where it gets genuinely disturbing. At the time of European contact, an estimated 30 to 60 million bisons roamed North America, a biomass so staggering it shaped the continent's grasslands, river systems, and soils at a continental scale. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained. The collapse took less than 2 decades. And according to historical records and the documented testimony of U.S. Army officers from the period, it was not purely the result of commercial hide hunting, it was policy. General Philip Sheridan, addressing the Texas legislature in 1875, explicitly encouraged the slaughter as a military strategy, arguing that hide hunters were doing more to solve what he called the Indian problem than the entire U.S. Army had managed in 30 years. Destroy the bison, and you destroy the economic and cultural foundation of every Plains nation that depended on them. The animal and the people were targeted together. In Canada, the same forces drove the same outcome. By the 1880s, the Plains bison was functionally extinct across the western prairies. What remained was a handful of scattered survivors. And then, almost accidentally, Canada helped save them through a sequence of events that began not with a government program, but with a rancher, a few orphaned calves, and a decision that nobody at the time understood would matter. In 1873, a Montana rancher named Samuel Walking Coyote brought 4 orphaned bison calves across the border into Canada's Flathead Valley. He sold them to ranchers Charles Allard and Michel Pablo, who built that nucleus into a herd of several hundred animals over the following decades. When the Pablo Allard herd was eventually purchased by the Canadian government in 1907 and relocated to what would become Elk Island National Park in Alberta, it carried with it nearly the entire surviving genetic legacy of the Plains bison on the continent. The species had been pulled back from functional extinction by a rancher, a business transaction, and a government purchase that historians describe as something close to an accident of timing. That Elk Island herd is where the 16 animals released into the Panther Valley in 2017 came from. They are the direct descendants of Walking Coyote's 4 calves. The Reintroduction team spent 2 years in consultation with First Nations, conducting habitat assessments and engineering the soft-release pasture, a fenced corridor designed to let the animals stabilize before the gates opened onto the full backcountry. The working assumption was that the transition would be gradual, managed, and slow. 18 months of careful acclimation before any meaningful range expansion was considered realistic. The gates opened in February 2019. What happened next exceeded every projection the team had prepared for. The population numbers alone were extraordinary. From 16 animals in 2017 to more than 130 by 2024, a 33% annual growth rate that sits at the absolute upper boundary of what reproductive biology allows for this species. Every calf survived its first winter at rates that surprised researchers. The herd was not just persisting in mountain terrain it had never encountered. It was thriving at a pace that the most optimistic projections had not modeled. But the biggest surprise was not the numbers. When the research team began analyzing the GPS collar data in detail, they found something that the models had no framework to explain. The herd was migrating, performing complex, seasonally timed movements from valley floor winter range up to subalpine meadows above the tree line during summer, then returning. Altitudinal migration, a behavior documented in pre-colonial historical records, absent for 140 years, with no living member of the herd ever having traveled the route or been taught it by an animal that had. The behavior had returned on its own, encoded somewhere in the animals themselves, dormant across 5 or 6 generations of enclosed park life, and reactivated the moment the terrain gave it room to express. If this is the kind of story that reshapes what you thought you knew, subscribe. We cover exactly this, the evidence that challenges the official narrative. Now back to the Panther Valley, because what the GPS data revealed about the land itself is the part that changes everything. The field surveys told a story that the migration data had only hinted at. As researchers mapped the Panther Valley across successive seasons, they documented something ecologists call heterogeneity, a mosaic of heavily grazed patches, lightly disturbed areas, and zones of dense, untouched vegetation, all interlocking across the landscape in patterns that no other species in that ecosystem produces. Elk graze, bighorn sheep graze, none of them graze like this. The bison were not simply consuming the valley. They were restructuring it, creating a patchwork of ecological conditions that functions, according to the 2023 Frontiers in Conservation Science paper, as habitat architecture for dozens of dependent species simultaneously. And then there were the wallows. By the time the research team conducted their vegetation assessments, new wallow depressions had appeared across the valley floor, bare circles of churned mineral soil where none had existed within living memory. Each one a micro-habitat, each one collecting water, exposing seedbeds, attracting insects, drawing in birds. The land was not recovering from bison grazing. It was being rebuilt by it, piece by piece, depression by depression, in a process that had been absent from this valley since before Canada existed as a nation. Let that land for a second. And that was only the ecological surprise. Because running alongside everything the bison were doing to the soil and the grass, something equally significant was happening between the herd and the people who had always known them. From the earliest planning stages, Parks Canada understood that this reintroduction could not be a purely scientific exercise. The bison had not just been removed from this land. They had been removed from a relationship, one that First Nations across the region had maintained for thousands of years, and that the slaughter of the 1880s had severed as deliberately as it severed the ecological web. 8 First Nations were involved in the Panther Valley project before a single animal was loaded into a container. Their knowledge, their protocols, and their ceremonies were not consulted as a formality. They were treated as a foundational component of the management framework. Karsten Heuer, the Parks Canada project manager who oversaw the reintroduction from its inception, has been direct about what the data and the cultural partnership together revealed. The herd, he has stated, wants to move beyond the boundaries that humans have drawn across park lines, across jurisdictions, across the administrative edges that mean nothing to an animal following instincts, encoded over 10,000 years. How society responds to that pressure, he argues, will determine whether this becomes a permanent restoration or a managed exhibit. That is not a scientific question, it is a political one, and the answer carries consequences far beyond the Panther Valley. If you want to know the shape of what's coming, drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe. But Banff is not the only place where a missing species is rewriting what we thought we understood about a landscape. The pattern that emerges from the Panther Valley data points towards something larger than a single reintroduction. 16 animals, 1 valley, 7 years, and a cascade of ecological and cultural restoration that the models said should not have been possible at that speed or at that scale. The bison did not read the models. They simply did what they were built to do, and in doing so, revealed that every landscape we have studied without its keystone species has been giving us incomplete data. We have been measuring broken systems and calling the results normal, which raises a question that conservation ecologists are now being forced to take seriously. If reinserting one missing species can produce effects this significant, this fast, and this far beyond prediction, what other processes are sitting dormant in landscapes across this continent, waiting for the missing piece to return? The next video in this series follows that question to the Atlantic coast of the United States, where 245 bald eagles have recolonized a stretch of coastline that had not supported a breeding population in living memory, and where what they are doing to the estuary beneath their nests is producing the same pattern of unpredicted ecological reconstruction that the bison produced in the Rockies. Different species, different ecosystem, same disturbing implication. Turn on notifications, because what the eagle data reveals goes even deeper.